as you know, the US recently declared the war in Sudan a genocide. It's a rare designation. How does this shift in language translate into meaningful accountability, particularly for the systematic targeting of women and girls?
Yeah, so you are well aware, as all of us are, that since April 2023, the Sudanese armed forces, as well as the rapid support forces, have launched this horrible, brutal conflict and attack against the Sudanese people. And ever since I came into this position, I joined a month after it began. It's been top of mind for me, watching the catastrophe um, in front of our eyes with so many thousands of Sudanese affected by this by the worst famine in recent history in Sudan, and also the millions who've been displaced. So all of that is what obviously the Department of State and the U.S. government has been um, tracking, following, and so the news that came last week um, was one of many actions that the US government has taken since 2023. You know that the Secretary of State actually concluded that members of SAF and RSF then had committed war crimes, that they were engaged in ethnic cleansing, that there were crimes against humanity. So this is the next step. The determination of genocide requires is a higher bar, in a sense, of intent, as well as the killing. And so that's what we finally were able to make a determination of genocide in Sudan that has been, it's concluded that members of the RSF and their allied militia are responsible for that. Um, they have sanctioned the RSF leader, Hemeti, as you have heard. And I think that that is because it's specifically cited as for committing those atrocities and for the genocide, but there's specific mention of the sexual violence and the gender-based violence, which I think was really important to the women of Sudan for that to be specifically mentioned. There will be economic sanctions as well against companies that they own in UAE. So that's a way to get at them financially as well. And then because of his involvement in gross violations against human rights in Darfur, particularly the mass rape of civilians, they are he's ineligible for travel to the United States as well. So I think the US government has used all of the tools available to it to hold him and his and the horrific actions that he has perpetrated to account. So I think that that is what gives me some hope that, not just for Sudan, but for all of the conflicts around the world, that it is possible to hold people accountable. And I can tell you that the fact that we had the Jeddah Commitment, Declaration of Commitment, and the Code of Conduct that Special Envoy Perriello had introduced and that the women had advised on and contributed to. The fact that they had committed to all that and then didn't abide by that, um, they really deserved to be held accountable. And I'm glad that this happened.
Absolutely. That's really good to hear. So as, as you know, Kelly is our senior editor at More to Her Story. And we're currently working on this piece about the RSF deliberately targeting female medical staff and hospitals. We've heard reports of women being gang raped inside hospitals and then later committing suicide. Have you heard of these reports? And what is the US doing to address these specific kind of targeting of female medical staff and hospitals?
I know that we're tracking all of the atrocities that are happening and documenting that. My office in particular is concerned with all the gender-based violence and sexual slavery and acts of, conflict-related sexual violence in particular. And the US remains committed to preventing and responding to GBV in all its forms, especially in conflict, to the conflict-related sexual violence, by providing the necessary supports. We've done that in Ukraine as well. And I feel like, um, the atrocities that we're seeing unfold in Sudan are the most horrific. The psychological trauma, it's a way to terrorize.
Hmm.
It's a way to terrorize. And the US holds a position that sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence, GBV, is not an inevitable part of conflict and should never be. And so to be able to hold them accountable for those acts, I don't specifically have all of the details on the hospitals. I read about it in the newspaper every morning. But yeah, it's not surprising given the number of atrocities that they have committed already, that they do not follow international humanitarian law, they do not follow any conventions um, in the conduct of this conflict. So I'm not surprised, and I'm glad that you're tracking it.
Ambassador Gupta, when it comes to documenting and finding, I guess, the materials necessary to use these levers of influence, such as sanctions and declaring genocide, what have been some of the challenges along the way in being able to have the material evidence to declare genocide, to place these sanctions on RSF fighters? And if I can add to that, because we are specifically looking at hospitals and targeting of um, medical professionals, if there has been any evidence that your team has found specifically with that, and the challenges that might be inherent in finding that specific information.
So I should say that my office doesn't actually collect that evidence. We have an office of global criminal justice that does that, together with our Africa Bureau and the Sudan desk. So they're the ones who gather the necessary evidence and data through reports that come to us from the ground. I have just heard from the women of Sudan, and I can tell you the women that we interact with have reported horrific incidents, the capture of homes, of civilian homes that are then used as military outposts. The fact that emergency care in hospitals is being stopped and blocked, and you're right, hospitals are being targeted, that starvation is being used as a tool of war. So I can just tell you from the accounts that we hear from the women that we interact with, Sudanese women leaders who have been part of conflicts in the past, have used their voice to demand peace. That's who we get the evidence from. But obviously, when you're doing it from a legal standpoint, you have to be much more rigorous and gather it from multiple sources. And I know that that's what they did, and which is why we were able to make the determination.
Are there any developing US strategies under your guidance to hold accountable people that are committing these crimes?
Yes, so I'll tell you that, ever since I joined, we have a law. We have the Women, Peace and Security Law that was passed in 2017 that requires women's participation and voice and protection to be a significant part of women, peace and security negotiations and peace building negotiations, etc. And yet I have watched as women were not involved in the initial part of the conflict and are often not involved in many conflicts. So we were very heartened to work with Special Envoy Tom Perriello, who's the Special Envoy for Sudan, to bring women's voices into the technical and peace building sort of negotiations and discussions that he was having with his counterparts across the UN and with other governments. So in particular, what we are proudest of is the fact that in the talks that took place in Switzerland most recently in August, my office was able to bring 14 Sudanese women to Geneva to contribute to those talks. And I think that's what we really want to do every single time. And the fact that we were able to do it for Sudan and for these particular negotiations was extremely heartening that it can be done. And what was interesting was that the women who gathered there, we were able to make that happen because of a program that we have called the She Wins program that has a rapid response fund. So in very short notice, we were able to deploy the funds necessary to bring the women from very many different locations, some within Sudan, but many in other refugee camps and other sites, to Geneva, and to sort of provide their inputs, their sort of reality check of what it's like on the ground, to contribute to the priorities that what we call the Alps group was discussing at that moment in Switzerland, which was the cessation of hostilities, how to increase humanitarian aid, and how to ensure some level of monitoring and accountability. And so for each of those areas, what we did was we had the women gather and sort of workshop ideas and recommendations facilitated expertly by a woman who's done this before. And those recommendations, then they were able to personally share with Special Envoy Perriello. So to be able to reach the highest level within the US government who's involved in these issues, and then actually were able to join the entire technical working group that was having these discussions in Switzerland and share their stories, their personal stories, as well as their expertise, because each of them were experts in their own right. They've often been part of mediation processes, negotiation processes. Some of them are the ones actually providing the critical aid on the ground. They're the ones trying to get food to starving families. So to hear from them, the very specific local detail of what things are happening, where, and where may be sort of points for humanitarian access, that the secretary and the special envoy and the others should explore, was enormously valuable to those technical discussions, and resulted, in fact, an increase in access to humanitarian aid. So Special Envoy Perriello and I are still very involved in conversations with those same women. We call them sort of our women's advisory group, and because it gives them a voice. Because I think that's the most impressive, is that yes, women have been disproportionately affected by all of the violence and the starvation and the horrors of war. But what's incredible about women each and every time in any conflict is their ability to be agents of change, to demand that conflict be stopped, that to come up with solutions and possibilities within a horrific situation. So they have agency, and if given a seat at the table, that agency can be put into action. And I think that their input is truly valuable, which is why we have the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, that women should be engaged in all these mediation and negotiation processes.
Absolutely. I'm curious, is there anything that a Sudanese woman shared with you, a woman on your advisory board, is there something that she shared with you that really stuck with you, that she maybe...
Well, I mean, a couple of things that really hit home. One is, starvation is a weapon of war, for them to actually introduce that into the discussions as something that should be explicitly mentioned. In the code of conduct, it was the women who insisted that conflict-related sexual violence, sexual slavery, abductions should be included in the code of conduct that the RSF leaders signed off on and committed to, and which is why we can now hold them accountable for that. So I think that's a concrete contribution that the women in the advisory group made. I will tell you that one of the things that struck me the most in the conversations was their definition of the term cessation of hostilities. As one of the women said in the discussion, it's not just about putting down arms, it's about stopping rape. It's about stopping gender-based violence. So that is a cessation of hostilities. Don't discuss it just in the context of putting down your arms and weapons, because we are being terrorized by more than weapons. Open up, allow us to farm, allow us to grow our food. Don't use starvation as a weapon of war. So the concept of what all the dimensions of a conflict and the different ways in which populations are terrorized came to light for me with great clarity and horror because of the stories that the women told. The other piece of it that was really striking was the enormous courage. I mean, they are, despite going through such horrors, and fleeing for their lives, living in conditions in other countries that are far, far, um, you know, far away from what we would consider reasonable conditions, they still are able to pull it all together and make recommendations, concrete policy recommendations on what should be done,
Hmm.
not just wallow in their own grief and in their own sorrow. So it was fascinating to me to see, and this is the power of women, right? When we all sat together, they would cry, they would weep while telling their stories, and then burst into song to support each other. They would describe some particular horror that they'd been through, leaving their children behind, being forced to run and flee for their lives, knowing that neighbors were less protected, telling those stories and then making jokes a second later. Supporting each other in different ways
Hmm.
um, was was really commendable to see how much inner strength they have. But it's not something that we should take for granted, right? They're doing it despite all the hell they've been through. And I really feel like the little that I was able to do in trying to bring them together with my team, the work of the team, to use the resources we had to make sure that their voices were heard. Um, for me, it's one of the biggest.
Yeah. The power of humanity is quite remarkable, like
Yep.
the worst times.
Yeah.
Um,
It's also incredible to see. It was incredible to see um, the technical experts who probably deal with these conflicts all the time, and you know how you develop a certain ability to cope with these horrors, to listen to this constantly, but to watch them as they heard these women tell their personal stories, because women, they were willing to be vulnerable in front of this group of technical experts
Mm.
just to share the stories. That reality check is really important when you're so removed from the situation, trying to have those technical discussions on what might help. And I think that every one of the people sitting around that table who were technical experts later came and told the women, many of them told me how much that had helped to
Mm.
to sort of remind them this was about real people, real families, real stories. Um, and that's motivating in a very different way
Absolutely.
to come up with solutions.
Ambassador, as you prepare to transition out of your role, are there any strategies or policies that you hope the incoming administration will prioritize? Uh,
Well, the Women, Peace and Security Act was passed under the first Trump administration.
hmm,
And so I am really hoping that it was in 2017 that women, peace and security will remain a high priority for the new administration. We are really looking, we have in this past couple of years have expanded the capacity building and exchange that can happen between countries who have sort of developed national action plans for them to be able to share with each other. We've set up something called the Centers of Excellence in different parts of the world, where there's one in Colombia now that we entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Colombian government on. There's one in the Philippines, there's one in Kosovo. And we're really hoping that these regional centers of excellence will build the capacity, will provide a forum for countries in the region, in each region, to sort of share lessons learned and best practice, so that the principles of women, peace, and security of 1325 can actually be implemented. The other piece that I think is really important in order to move this agenda forward is to have, like we have in the US, we're the only country in the world that has a law but we're only one of two countries in the world that actually has a parliamentary caucus, a sort of a legislative caucus. So we have the Women, Peace and Security Caucus on the Hill that is bipartisan and that has been very active. It's good to have that because they're the ones who hold the purse strings. So if you really want something to happen, you need to have legislators involved and engaged. They hold government then accountable for making sure that the act is actually being implemented. So it's worked very well, I think, here, and is a strong accountability check on whether or not these principles are being implemented. Similarly, in Japan, the Diet has a caucus as well that they call the network, a
Mm.
Women, Peace and Security Network. We'd like to see more of that kind of engagement from parliamentarians around the world, because when you have that, then your national, action plan for women, peace, and security doesn't just remain on the shelf. It gets some budget behind it, and then can be implemented.
Mm.
So that's our hope: is that over the next 4 years, I really hope that a few of these pieces can be taken forward in order to sort of transform what has so far just been verbiage, right? It's sort of policy and words into actual implementation. And one way to do that is what we did for Sudan, which is, and for Syria actually, which is to have women's advisory boards, to
Mm.
have a group of women who are brought together as expert advisors who can be at the table with the decision makers, with the peace builders, with the negotiators, informing them, being a check on them, letting them know what the reality on the ground is. That's ideally what we'd like to see for each conflict as it emerges, rather than waiting for it to happen later. So
Yeah.
those are some of the strategies we're really trying to push forward. For me, because it happened so just before I joined, it became like the signature conflict that I wanted to make sure we were able to do something about. And so this is my last week in office. The fact that this determination happened last week, and that the code of conduct that the women that we brought to the table contributed to,
Mm.
and that code of conduct was used in order to hold the RSF responsible, and someday the SAF as well, hopefully the Sudanese Armed Forces as well, because they are no less brutal. Um, uh, you know, that to me is the high point of my time here in office.
That's amazing. Um, Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
classic.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kelly.